The night did not begin with silence. It began with a storm. A storm that whispered secrets through the trembling leaves and scattered raindrops like a million tiny diamonds across the dark earth. Beneath that restless sky, a lone rider guided his weary horse along the narrow trail, each step echoing with both solitude and purpose. He was not searching for love, not searching for destiny, and yet the air felt heavy with the promise that something would soon shift, as though fate had been quietly preparing a stage just for him. His name was Elias, and though his heart carried the dust of countless journeys, it also carried a longing he had never dared to name. The kind of longing that hides deep beneath the skin, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Far in the distance, a lantern flickered, fragile against the roaring night. It should not have been there. This trail was known only to hunters and wanderers, but that trembling light burned like a call no traveler could ignore. Elias tightened the reins, his pulse quickening as though his body already understood what his mind could not. When he reached the bend of the trail, he saw her. She was standing beneath a crooked oak tree, rain tangled in her hair, her eyes wide with both fear and defiance. A stranger, yet not a stranger at all. She looked like the answer to questions he had never asked, the warmth his soul had silently prayed for on nights when loneliness was too sharp to bear. For a heartbeat, the storm faded into stillness. It was only the two of them, her breath trembling in the shadows, his gaze locked on hers. And in that fragile silence, Elias felt the world tip towards something irreversible. He should have spoken, should have asked her name, but words failed him, lost in the quiet thunder of recognition. Sometimes the heart knows before the mind can reason, before the soul dares to hope. The rain grew stronger, blurring the edges of the night, yet he could not move away. She looked like a dream sculpted from sorrow and courage, and every drop of water that slid down her face gleamed like proof that she was real, not an apparition born of his weary imagination. A soft ache stirred within him, a healing ache that whispered of beginnings rather than endings. And though she did not speak, her presence felt like a story unfolding, an unfinished melody carried on the breath of the storm. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the mud, and with each step toward her, he felt the pull of something larger than himself. She clutched a small bundle close to her chest, as if it were both shield and secret. Her eyes never left his, even as her body trembled beneath the cold night air. That fragile defiance carved itself into his memory. Strength wrapped in vulnerability, fire wrapped in silence. He reached out, not to touch, not to claim, but simply to bridge the impossible distance that separated them. And then, like a blade through the quiet, the crack of branches broke the spell. From the shadows, other figures emerged, shadows of the world she came from, a world that would not welcome him. In an instant, the fragile thread of connection became a spark caught between danger and desire. He understood, without words, that she was not free to belong to him, and yet some force greater than the storm demanded he try. The night carried them into a chaos neither of them could control, but even within the fear and the clash of worlds, a seed had been planted. The seed of a love that could heal, a love that could burn, a love that could remake the boundaries of two hearts and two lives. As Elias braced himself for what would come, he held on to the unspoken truth that destiny had already chosen for them both. If this story stirs something in your heart, if it gives you warmth like a lantern against your own storms, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Leave a comment, let your voice join this unfolding tale, and if the healing rhythm of these words speaks to you, remember to like and subscribe. Your presence here is not just support. It is the gentle touch of connection that allows stories like this to keep breathing, to keep healing, to keep weaving love where it is most needed. And so the night continued, not with endings, but with the promise of something greater, as Elias and the mysterious woman stood on the edge of a journey that would carry them far beyond fear, into the fragile, luminous heart of love itself. The dawn did not arrive with sunlight, but with a soft, muted glow that made the world appear drenched in silver. Mist curled between the trees, clinging to the ground as though it wanted to shield the earth from the sharpness of day. Elias had not slept. His eyes had remained fixed on the place where she had vanished hours earlier, swallowed by the forest and the shadows of her people. He should have turned back, should have convinced himself that she was only a fleeting figure, a dream conjured by the storm. Yet his heart throbbed with a quiet certainty that she was not a passing vision. She was the thread his soul had been waiting to follow, and no amount of fear could cut it. As he stood by the dying embers of his campfire, the memory of her lingered like warmth in his palms, a warmth that seemed impossible to forget. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her gaze, dark, searching, trembling with both resistance and something softer she dared not name. That look had carved itself into him, deeper than any scar earned on the road. He carried it now as one carries a fragile secret, a secret too beautiful and too dangerous to release. He mounted his horse again, the leather creaking under his weight, and let the animal guide him along the faint trail that wound into the valley. The world smelled of damp earth and pine resin, a perfume of rebirth that felt almost healing. The rain had washed the land clean, but it had not washed her from his thoughts. Each bend of the path whispered of her presence, as though the air itself carried echoes of her footsteps. Hours passed in silence, until the hush of the forest was broken by a sound, soft at first, then rising into a melody that shimmered against the trees. It was singing, fragile, trembling, yet carrying the kind of strength only born of sorrow. Elias froze, his chest tightening with an ache that was both sharp and sweet. He followed the sound cautiously, moving through the underbrush until the trees opened into a small clearing where sunlight spilled like liquid gold across the grass. And there she was. She sat upon a rock by the stream, her long hair loosened and glistening in the morning light. She was weaving strands of grass together, her lips shaping words in a language Elias could not understand, and yet he felt every note pierce him like truth. The song seemed to rise from the earth itself, carrying grief, carrying defiance, carrying hope too fragile to name. For a long moment he could only stand there, hidden, afraid to shatter the fragile beauty of her solitude. When she finally looked up, her eyes found him instantly, as though she had known all along that he was there. She did not flinch, did not cry out. Instead, her gaze softened, carrying the weight of secrets and the fragile kindness of one who has already suffered too much. The silence between them stretched like a fragile bridge, and Elias crossed it with the only offering he had: honesty. "I couldn't leave," he said quietly, his voice unsteady, almost breaking. "Not when I knew you were here." She did not answer with words. Instead, she set the woven grass crown gently upon the rock and rose to her feet, the hem of her simple dress brushing against the dew-kissed earth. For the first time, she stepped closer, close enough for him to see the faint shimmer of tears clinging to her lashes. She lifted her hand slightly, as though caught between pushing him away and reaching for him. The conflict in her eyes was raw, and yet beneath it, a fragile tenderness glowed like a hidden flame. "Your people will not understand," she whispered at last, her voice low and edged with fear. "They will see you as danger. They already do." Elias felt the words like stones pressed against his chest. Yet he did not retreat. He stepped forward until only the thin veil of morning air separated them. "Then let them," he murmured, his voice steady with quiet conviction. "Because I see you, not fear, not danger, just you." Something shifted then, as if the very earth had exhaled. She lowered her gaze, and for the briefest of moments she allowed him to see her vulnerability without armor, without defiance. It was enough to break something open in both of them. He did not touch her, though every fiber of his being longed to. Instead, he stood steady, giving her the space to decide if this fragile thread of connection would unravel or hold. She turned slightly, as though to retreat into the safety of the woods, but paused. Her hand brushed the woven crown of grass, and with a hesitant motion she lifted it and placed it in his hands. Her fingers lingered against his for an instant, warm and trembling, and that single touch felt like a promise carved into eternity. Elias closed his hand around the delicate crown, feeling its fragility, its healing softness, and the unspoken weight it carried. She met his eyes once more, and though she said nothing, her silence was filled with meaning. She turned away then, vanishing into the shadows of the forest, leaving him alone with the fragile gift that now pulsed like a heartbeat in his palm. And in that quiet clearing, Elias understood that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would not be gentle, but it would be worth every scar. For love, once awakened, does not return to slumber. It only deepens, only grows, only heals. The morning light spread wider, carrying him toward the next step of their intertwined journey, where fate would test them and hearts would be forced to choose between fear and the quiet courage of love. The forest carried the weight of secrets, its branches heavy with shadows and whispers. Elias rode deeper into the valley, the woven crown of grass still tucked safely within his coat, pressed close to his chest as though it were the only thing anchoring him to this new, fragile world. Every bend in the path carried with it the scent of damp moss, the sound of water dripping from leaves, the rustle of unseen movement that reminded him he was trespassing where he did not belong. And yet, despite the danger, there was a calm within him, a healing calm born from the memory of her hand brushing his when she entrusted him with that simple gift. He could not name her yet, not fully. She had spoken few words, just enough to warn him, just enough to show her fear, and still he felt her presence woven into the air as though every tree carried a trace of her spirit. He imagined her childhood here, running through these woods barefoot, her laughter carried by the wind, her tears buried in the soil. To know her was to know this land, and to step into it was to risk being consumed by it. But Elias had never been afraid of losing himself if it meant finding something true. By midday, the forest gave way to a wide clearing where sunlight poured like liquid fire over the grass. At its center stood a circle of stones, ancient and silent, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of storms and sun. He dismounted slowly, drawn to the place as though it held a piece of the story he had stumbled into. There was a hush here, a sacredness that made his breath catch. And then he saw her again. She was kneeling by the stones, her hands pressed gently to their cold surfaces, her head bowed as though in prayer. The sight of her stole the strength from his legs. She looked like part of the earth itself, rooted, eternal, and unbearably beautiful. He took a step forward, careful not to break the quiet reverence. But she lifted her head, and her eyes found him instantly. There was no surprise in her gaze, only resignation, as if she had known he would come. "You should not be here," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of centuries, though she was young. "This place is not for outsiders." Elias placed a hand over his chest, where the crown rested, and his voice was steady, though his heart raced. "Then why does it feel like I've carried it inside me all along?" Something in her expression softened, though fear lingered at the edges of her eyes. She rose slowly, the sunlight catching strands of her hair, weaving them into gold. Her movements were careful, as though every gesture carried meaning. "My people will not forgive easily," she said. "They see only danger in you, and if they find you here, they will not listen to what your heart says." "Then let them hear what yours says," he answered quietly. For a long moment, silence hung between them. A bird soared high above, its wings cutting across the sky, and she followed its path as if searching for courage in its flight. When she looked back at him, her eyes carried the storm and the calm all at once. She stepped closer, so close he could see the faint lines of worry etched into her brow, the trace of sorrow that no laughter had yet erased. Her hand hovered in the air, trembling as though she battled between retreat and surrender. Then, as though guided by something greater than fear, she touched his arm. The contact was light, tentative, but it burned through him like fire finding dry wood. "You do not understand what you ask," she said softly, her fingers tightening just slightly, unwilling to let go, even as she warned him. To choose you would mean to betray them. To trust you would mean to risk everything. Elias bent his head, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more vow than plea. "And to walk away from you would mean to betray myself. I cannot leave. Not now." Her breath caught, and he felt the fragile trembling of her resolve. For the first time, her eyes filled with tears that she did not hide. They clung to her lashes, shimmering like jewels, each one a testament to battles fought in silence. He wanted to brush them away, to promise her a world without fear, but he knew promises were fragile things. So instead, he offered her the only truth he owned, his presence, steady and unwavering. A distant sound shattered the moment. The deep echo of drums carried faintly through the trees. Her body went rigid, and her hand slipped from his arm. "They are calling us," she murmured, her voice taut with urgency. "I cannot be found with you." Fear tightened around his chest, but he did not step back. He searched her eyes, desperate to find something to hold on to. She hesitated, torn between the path of duty and the fragile, blooming tenderness that tethered her heart to his. Finally, with a trembling motion, she pressed something into his palm, a small pendant carved from bone, smooth and warm from the heat of her skin. "Keep this," she said, her voice breaking. "If they see you, show it. It may save you, or it may condemn you. I cannot promise more." Her fingers lingered on his for the briefest moment. Then she turned and vanished into the trees, leaving only the sound of her footsteps fading into silence. Elias stood rooted in the clearing, the pendant clutched tight in his hand, his heart beating with the rhythm of the drums that grew louder with every passing second. The air trembled with danger, but also with something unshakable. Hope, fragile and fierce, a hope that whispered healing to the wounds of fear. He knew the path ahead would be filled with fire, but he also knew he would walk it willingly, because it was no longer just his journey. It was theirs. And as the drums thundered through the forest, Elias stepped forward, the pendant heavy in his hand, carrying him toward a fate that would test love, faith, and the fragile courage of two hearts that refused to let go. The drums faded into the night like distant thunder, leaving only the whisper of wind and the soft hum of crickets to fill the silence. Elias walked carefully through the shadowed path. The pendant she had pressed into his palm still clutched tightly in his hand. It felt alive somehow, warmed by her touch, as though it carried her heartbeat within its carved lines. Every time he glanced at it, he felt the fragile comfort of knowing she had trusted him, if only for a moment, with something that belonged to her soul. That trust, however small, was enough to keep him moving forward, even as the weight of danger pressed heavier against him. The forest thickened with every step, branches twisting above like guardians, watching, judging. Elias could feel eyes upon him, unseen, silent, but present. The people she had warned him about were near. He could sense them in the shift of the air, the rustle of unseen feet upon the earth, the way the silence seemed too deliberate, too sharp. And yet he did not turn back. Fear whispered to him, but so did hope. It told him that somewhere beyond the shadows she was listening too, waiting to see if he would stand or falter. The moon emerged from the clouds, silver and soft, bathing the path in light. Elias paused, his breath catching at the sight before him. She was there again, standing on the other side of the clearing, her figure bathed in moonlight as though the heavens themselves had chosen to illuminate her. She wore a cloak now, its edges embroidered with symbols that shimmered faintly under the night sky. In her presence, the forest no longer felt hostile. It felt like a sanctuary. She did not speak at first. Her eyes searched his face as though seeking proof that he was still the man she had risked herself to trust. Finally, she stepped closer, each movement graceful, deliberate, and filled with hesitation. "You should not have followed," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Every step you take here ties you deeper into a fate you may not escape." Elias met her gaze, his voice steady with quiet warmth. "If that fate keeps me near you, then I will not regret it." Her breath trembled, and she lowered her eyes, the moonlight catching on her lashes. "You do not understand," she said softly. "Our worlds are not meant to join. My people carry memories long and sharp, and their hearts do not forgive easily. To walk beside me is to invite their wrath. And to walk away, Elias replied gently, is to abandon what my heart already knows. It knows you, even if the world denies it. The silence stretched between them, fragile yet powerful, a silence filled with words neither dared to speak. She turned slightly, as though battling with herself, and then her hand rose, trembling, to rest lightly against his chest. The touch was soft, almost weightless, but Elias felt it as though she had pressed straight into his soul. Her palm lingered over the place where the grass crown was hidden, and her eyes lifted to his once more. "There is a part of me," she admitted, her voice breaking with tenderness, "that wishes I could believe, that wishes I could step beyond the lines drawn around me. When I see you, I feel lighter, as though something in me begins to heal." Elias covered her hand with his own, firm yet tender, grounding her trembling. "Then let me carry that weight with you," he whispered. "Even if the world stands against us, let me be the place you can rest." Her eyes filled with unshed tears, glistening in the moonlight like stars caught between sorrow and hope. She leaned closer, her forehead resting gently against his chest, and for the first time she allowed herself to let go of fear, if only for a moment. The warmth of her presence washed through him like fire and water together, burning, cleansing, healing. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of her hair, the quiet rhythm of her breath, and he knew that no matter what storm awaited, this single moment was worth everything. But the peace could not last. The crack of a branch shattered the quiet, sharp and deliberate. Her body stiffened, and she pulled away instantly, her eyes wide with fear. Figures began to emerge from the trees, shadows forming into men, their faces painted, their weapons glinting faintly in the silver light. They moved with precision, surrounding the clearing, their eyes locked on Elias like hunters closing in on prey. She stepped in front of him, her cloak falling open as she raised her hands in a plea. "No!" her voice rang out, clear and desperate. "He is not our enemy!" But her words met only silence and suspicion. The warriors did not lower their weapons. If anything, their stance grew tighter, their resolve sharper. Elias felt his heart pound, not with fear for himself, but with fear for her. He knew in their eyes he was the intruder, the danger, the unforgivable presence. Yet even as they closed in, she stood firm, her body a shield between him and their wrath. In that act, Elias saw the truth of her heart, not just fear, not just duty, but the fragile, defiant bloom of love she could no longer hide. The leader of the warriors stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as they fell upon Elias, then the pendant in his hand. Recognition flickered there, followed by a shift in the air, a tension that trembled between violence and restraint. For the first time, Elias felt that the small piece of her he carried might save him, or destroy him. The night held its breath, balanced on the edge of choice, as hearts collided with destiny. And as she reached back to grasp Elias's hand, her fingers twining with his in open defiance, he knew that the path ahead would no longer belong to either of them alone. The drums in the distance began again, low and steady, echoing through the valley like the heartbeat of fate itself, calling them toward a future where love would either break under the weight of the world or bloom strong enough to heal it. The night tightened around them, thick with breathless tension, the air carrying the sharp scent of pine sap and smoke from unseen fires deeper in the valley. Elias stood at the center of the circle, her hand woven firmly into his, both shielded and exposed by her fragile defiance. The warrior's eyes flickered like flint against steel, their silence more dangerous than any shouted threat. He could feel their judgment pressing into his skin, branding him an intruder, an enemy, an unwanted shadow in their sacred space. And yet, her presence beside him softened the weight, a quiet balm that kept his spirit steady. She was trembling, but not from fear, rather from the impossible burden of choosing between two worlds that demanded her loyalty. The leader stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the clearing, the carved lines of paint on his face catching the moonlight. His gaze dropped to the pendant Elias held, and for a moment the hardened steel in his eyes softened into something else. Recognition, maybe even hesitation. He spoke in a low voice, words Elias could not understand, but their rhythm carried power, authority, the unbending force of law carved into blood and bone. She answered him swiftly, her tone urgent, her voice breaking as though each syllable carved pieces from her heart. The warriors shifted, their hands tightening on weapons, their eyes moving from Elias to her and back again. Elias understood nothing of their language, but he understood the language of her body, the way her shoulders squared in desperation, the way her voice cracked as she pleaded, the way her grip on his hand refused to let go, even as the weight of her people pressed against her. She was risking herself for him, standing against the tide of her own blood. That truth burned through him with both awe and terror. The leader's voice rose, sharp and final, and silence fell like a blade. She turned to Elias then, her eyes wet with unshed tears, her lips trembling, as though she wanted to say everything, but could not say anything at all. Instead, she pressed the back of his hand to her chest, right over the frantic pounding of her heart. The rhythm raced against his palm, wild and human and undeniable, and for that single heartbeat, no wall, no tribe, no world could separate them. But the warriors moved closer, their circle tightening. The moment shattered, replaced with the cold breath of inevitability. She lowered her hand slowly, slipping from him, though her eyes screamed that it was not by choice. Two men stepped forward, their bodies tense, prepared to seize Elias. He braced himself, ready to fight if he must, though he knew resistance would only end in death. Before they could reach him, she cried out sharply, her voice like a breaking wave. The sound stilled them, but only barely. She spoke again, faster this time, her words tumbling like water over stone, desperate and fierce. Elias could feel the force of her will in the air, even without understanding. She pointed to the pendant, then to him, then to her own heart, as though stitching their stories together in front of the eyes that wanted to tear them apart. The leader studied her, long and hard, then turned his gaze upon Elias. In that look, Elias felt himself measured, weighed, judged against centuries of wounds he had never inflicted, but was guilty of by skin and heritage alone. Finally, the leader gestured with his hand, a command Elias could not decipher. The warriors lowered their weapons, but not fully. Their bodies remained tense, their eyes sharp. He had been spared for now, but not welcomed. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging in relief, though her eyes still glistened with fear. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against his arm, just enough to remind him he was not alone. "You must go with them," she whispered, her words trembling but urgent. "If you resist, you will die. If you walk, there is still a chance." Elias nodded slowly, though every part of him recoiled at the thought of being led deeper into a world that wanted him gone. He trusted her voice more than the fear in his chest. He trusted her because within her words there was always a thread of healing, a promise that even through the storm there might be light. The warriors motioned for him to move, and he obeyed, his steps heavy but steady. She walked beside him, close enough for their shoulders to brush, though she dared not take his hand again. Around them, the forest thickened, shadows swallowing their path as though the earth itself wanted to test their resolve. The silence pressed down, broken only by the occasional call of night birds or the distant howl of a wolf. Elias kept his gaze forward, but every so often he caught her glancing at him, her eyes soft with unspoken words. At last they reached a ridge overlooking a valley lit with scattered fires. Below, her people gathered, figures moving like silhouettes against the glow, their voices rising in a song that sounded both mournful and fierce. Elias felt the weight of history in that sound, the heartbeat of a people bound together by grief and strength. It was beautiful, but it was also terrifying, for he knew he was the stranger at the edge of their firelight. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear, and whispered, "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look away when they look at you. And no matter what happens, remember, what I gave you, I meant." Her hand brushed against the pocket where the pendant rested, and though she pulled away instantly, the warmth of her touch lingered, steadying him. The warriors guided him down the slope, into the circle of firelight, into the heart of her people's judgment. Faces turned, voices hushed, and the air grew thick with tension. Elias stood tall, though his heart thundered in his chest, and across the fire he saw her, standing slightly apart, her eyes locked on his. She was his anchor, his reason, his fragile thread of hope. In that moment, Elias understood that whatever trial awaited, he would endure it, not because he believed he could win their acceptance, but because love, fragile, forbidden, healing, was worth every scar the world could carve into him. And as the fire crackled and the voices rose around him, he knew the night had only just begun, and the path toward her heart would demand more than courage. It would demand everything. The firelight painted long shadows across the gathering ground, flickering against faces carved with suspicion, pride, and grief. Elias stood at the center, his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest, though outwardly he kept his posture calm, steady, unyielding. He felt the weight of countless eyes upon him, measuring him, not as a man, but as a symbol of everything they had lost, everything they had endured. The pendant rested against his skin like a fragile shield, a small reminder of the thread that tethered him to her, to the unspoken trust she had placed in him when the world demanded distance. She stood apart from the circle, yet her presence was everywhere. He could feel her gaze anchoring him, soothing the storm in his veins, a healing warmth that pushed back against the fear pressing in from all sides. Her cloak fluttered faintly in the night wind, her hair catching sparks of firelight that made it gleam like strands of midnight spun with gold. Though she did not move toward him, the space between them pulsed with something alive, a current too powerful to be denied. The elder rose from his place by the largest fire, his movements deliberate, his eyes dark as river stone. His voice carried over the gathering, deep and resonant, each word landing like a verdict, though Elias could not understand their meaning. But he did not need to understand the language to feel its gravity. Every syllable was a question, every pause an accusation. Who are you, stranger? Why have you come here? Why should your presence not be judged as a wound against us? When the elder's voice stilled, silence wrapped around them like a noose. Then she stepped forward. Her people parted reluctantly as she walked, their whispers sharp, their eyes filled with a mix of doubt and pain. But she held her head high, her every movement graceful and unflinching, even as her heart trembled. She stopped at Elias's side, her fingers brushing his for the briefest of moments, so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all, but he felt it like a vow. Her words flowed quickly, rich with emotion, her voice carrying the urgency of truth. Elias caught fragments in her tone, pleading, defiant, unyielding. She spoke not as a daughter of her tribe bound by duty, but as a woman whose heart had already chosen. Though the language remained foreign to him, he could hear the healing lilt within her voice, the warmth that only truth could weave. The elder listened, his face unreadable, and then gestured toward Elias. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as expectation fell upon him. He knew he must speak, even if his words were clumsy, even if they did not understand. His chest rose as he gathered his courage, his voice carrying steady into the charged silence. "I came because I could not turn away," he said, his tone calm, deliberate. "Because when I saw her, I saw not a stranger, but someone my soul recognized. I have no desire to harm, no hunger for what is not mine. I only wish to stand beside her, even if the world says I should not. If that makes me guilty in your eyes, then let me bear that weight. But know this, I will not betray what is true, not even for my own life." His words dissolved into the night, translated only by the sincerity in his gaze. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then she reached for his hand openly, threading her fingers with his, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. The act rippled through the gathering like a spark on dry grass. Gasps rose, voices broke into heated debate, the circle trembling with outrage and disbelief. But the elder raised his hand, and silence reclaimed the night. His eyes lingered on their joined hands, then lifted to Elias's face. For the first time, the hardness in his gaze softened, though only slightly. He spoke again, slower now, his voice deep with the weariness of years. When he finished, she translated for Elias, her voice trembling but clear. "He says your place here is not yet earned, that trust is not given freely, but he will not cast you out tonight. Tomorrow you must prove yourself. You must walk the path they set before you, or be lost to them forever." Elias nodded, the decision already made in his heart. Whatever trial awaited, he would face it. Not for acceptance alone, but for her, for the love that had taken root between them like a fragile flame in the storm. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze, and in her eyes he saw both terror and hope. Her hand tightened around his, grounding him, a silent promise that no matter what trial the dawn would bring, they would face it together. The night stretched long, filled with watchful eyes and unspoken words. When the fires dimmed and the crowd dispersed, he was led to a small tent at the edge of the camp. Yet even as the guards lingered nearby, he could not sleep. The pendant pressed against his chest, the memory of her touch burned in his palm, and the sound of her voice lingered in his ears. He sat in the quiet, staring at the stars through the narrow opening of the tent, his heart whispering the truth he already knew. Love was not a thing to be bargained, not a thing to be silenced. It was a fire that once kindled, no storm could extinguish. And as the first faint light of dawn brushed the horizon, Elias rose with steady resolve, ready to step into the trial that would decide not only his fate, but the fragile future of their love. The dawn spilled softly across the valley, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, as though the heavens themselves wanted to offer healing after a night soaked in tension. Elias emerged from the tent where he had not slept, his eyes shadowed with weariness, but burning with quiet determination. The air was cool, carrying the scent of smoke from dying embers and the faint sweetness of wildflowers hidden among the grass. Around him, the camp stirred awake. Voices murmured, children's laughter rang in the distance, women prepared fires for the day. But the warriors watched him with unbroken vigilance, their expressions carved with stone, their silence louder than any words of hostility. She stood among them, her cloak gathered tightly around her shoulders, her hair unbound so it tumbled like dark water down her back. When their eyes met, the world narrowed to just the two of them, and though she did not move closer, the weight of her gaze steadied him. Her lips pressed together, caught between fear and hope, but her eyes carried something more, an unspoken plea, a silent vow that even if the trial threatened to tear them apart, her heart would remain tethered to his. The elder appeared, walking slowly, but with an authority that bent the air around him. He raised a carved staff, its surface etched with symbols older than memory, and the murmurs of the camp stilled instantly. His voice rang out, low and solemn, his words rolling like thunder across the valley. Though Elias could not understand the language, he understood the meaning carried in the crowd's reaction. Today he would be tested, not with questions, not with debate, but with actions that would determine if he was worthy to stand in their presence, let alone beside her. He was led away from the camp, accompanied by warriors whose silence pressed heavy against his back. The path wound through the forest, its floor still damp with dew, until it opened to a ravine where the river rushed wild and untamed, its roar filling the air. Across the water, steep cliffs rose like jagged teeth, their stone faces marked with narrow ledges and treacherous paths. One of the warriors gestured to the other side, speaking a single word Elias did not know, but could feel in his bones: cross. It was no simple challenge. The river churned with violent currents, its waters foaming white as they slammed against hidden rocks. The cliffs beyond were sheer and unforgiving, the climb dangerous even for those who knew the land. Elias felt the weight of the task settle over him, but when he glanced back, he saw her standing on the ridge above, her hands clasped tightly at her chest. She looked as though she wished to leap forward and take the trial with him, to shield him from every danger. Instead, she whispered something into the wind, words he could not hear, but felt inside his heart like a prayer. Elias stepped into the river. The cold struck like knives, stealing his breath, but he pressed forward, each movement measured, deliberate. The current seized him, pulling with merciless force, but he remembered the pendant against his chest, the fragile gift that pulsed with her warmth. He pushed forward, fighting the water as though it were the embodiment of every doubt and every barrier that had ever tried to keep them apart. His muscles burned, his breath ragged, but step by step, stone by stone, he forced his way across. When at last his hands gripped the far bank, he dragged himself up, gasping, water streaming from his body, but alive. The climb was worse. The cliff face was slick with moss, its ledges crumbling beneath his weight. More than once his boots slipped, sending shards of rock tumbling into the river below. His hands bled, his body ached, but still he climbed. He thought of her, the way her eyes had softened when she confessed that being near him made her feel lighter, the way her hand had lingered against his chest, the way her heart had raced beneath his palm. Love became his rope, his anchor, his reason. Every reach upward was a vow, every gasp of breath a promise that he would not let the world separate them. At last, after what felt like eternity, he reached the summit. The wind whipped around him, carrying with it the scent of pine, and the vast expanse of the world spread wide before his eyes. Below, the warriors raised their arms in acknowledgment, not approval, not yet, but recognition. He had not failed, he had not broken. She broke from the crowd then, rushing to the base of the cliff, her cloak billowing as she ran. By the time he descended the safer slope on the far side, she was there waiting, her face wet with tears she had not allowed anyone else to see. She reached for him without hesitation, her hands cradling his face, her thumbs brushing away the dirt and blood with a tenderness that melted every ache in his body. "You did it," she whispered, though no one else could hear. "You endured." Elias leaned into her touch, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment the noise of the crowd faded, the suspicion, the doubt, the weight of judgment, all gone. There was only her, warm and trembling, her presence like balm upon his wounds. "I did it for you," he murmured, his voice low, steady. "And I would do it again, 1,000 times, if it meant keeping this truth alive." She closed her eyes, her tears spilling freely now, and for the first time she allowed herself to press her lips softly against his cheek. It was not the boldness of lovers defying the world, but the tender touch of a heart that could no longer deny what it felt. Healing flowed through him like fire and water combined, filling every broken place inside with quiet light. But the world was not yet ready to yield. The elder stepped forward, his staff striking the earth with authority. The trial was not over. There were still questions of trust, of belonging, of loyalty that no river or cliff could answer. Elias drew a steady breath, his body weary, but his spirit stronger than ever. He knew this was only one step on a path that would demand everything from him. She slipped her hand into his once more, her grip firm, her eyes blazing with both fear and resolve. Together they turned to face the elder, to face the judgment that still loomed, their hearts bound by a love that had already proven it could endure storms, rivers, and stone. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it not as strangers, but as two souls intertwined, carrying within them the fragile, unyielding promise of healing love. The fire returned at dusk, casting a warm, trembling glow across the circle of faces that had gathered once more. Shadows stretched long, flickering across the ground, as though the earth itself carried witness to what was about to be decided. Elias stood tall, his body weary from the trial, his hands raw with cuts, his clothes torn and damp from the river and the climb. Yet his spirit carried a quiet strength, the kind of resilience born not from pride, but from love, from the healing warmth of knowing why he endured. Beside him she remained, her hand firmly joined with his, her presence a living vow that she would no longer let fear silence her heart. The elder lifted his staff once more, his eyes scanning the gathered crowd before they settled upon Elias. The murmurs faded into silence, every voice stilled, every breath held. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his words carrying not just judgment, but the memory of generations who had suffered, fought, and endured. Elias could not understand the language, but he felt the weight of history pressing through each syllable, the reminder that love was never born into a vacuum. It always entered a world scarred by wounds older than itself. She stepped forward, her voice rising in reply, strong and unwavering, though her eyes glistened with tears. She did not plead any more. She declared. She spoke of what she had seen in him, the man who had fought the river's wrath, who had scaled stone walls with nothing but determination, who had stood in the center of her people's judgment without breaking. She spoke of the moment he had looked upon her not with conquest, but with reverence, not with hunger, but with healing. She spoke of love, not as weakness, but as a bond that could mend what centuries of fear had torn apart. The crowd rippled with unrest. Some turned away, their hearts too guarded, too wounded to accept her truth. Others listened, their expressions softening, their eyes flickering with the memory of their own hidden longings. Love has a way of breaking into even the hardest stone, not with force, but with persistence, like water carving a canyon across the years. The elder lowered his head, his silence stretching, his expression unreadable. At last he lifted his gaze, his eyes sharp, yet softened by something new, perhaps recognition, perhaps reluctant respect. He spoke a final sentence, his voice deep, resonant. She translated in a whisper, her hand trembling in Elias's. He says the path is still dangerous, but he will not stand against us. He says we are free to walk it, together. Relief broke through her body like sunlight after a storm. Her arms wrapped around Elias, holding him tightly, her face buried against his chest. He pressed his lips to her hair, closing his eyes as the scent of smoke, earth, and her filled him. In that embrace, the world fell away. There was no tribe, no judgment, no history too heavy to bear. There was only the healing warmth of two souls daring to belong to one another. The fire crackled louder, throwing sparks into the night sky like tiny stars, as if the heavens themselves wished to witness their vow. Around them, voices rose in argument, in caution, in weary acceptance, but none of it mattered. What mattered was her heart pressed against his, steady and certain. What mattered was the truth they had both chosen, that love was worth every trial, every scar, every risk. Later, when the fire had burned lower and the camp quieted into the rhythm of sleep, they found themselves at the edge of the valley. The moonlight bathed them in silver, soft and healing, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. She leaned into him, her hand resting against his chest where the pendant still lay. "We are not safe," she whispered, her voice fragile, tender. "But we are together. And that is enough." Elias kissed her forehead gently, his lips lingering against her skin as though he could etch the promise deeper than words. "Together," he murmured, his voice steady as the earth beneath their feet. They stood there, two silhouettes bound by love, facing a horizon that promised struggle and hope alike. The world had not changed overnight, but within their embrace, a new world had begun, Love, fragile yet unyielding, would carry them forward. Healing, slow but certain, would grow between every step, every breath, every choice they made together. The night whispered around them, the stars spilling their ancient light as though blessing their vow. And as the wind wrapped them gently, Elias knew that whatever lay ahead, their story was no longer a question. It was an answer, a living truth, a flame that would not go out. If this story has touched your heart, if you felt the warmth of love and the gentle healing in these words, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Leave a comment, let your heart's voice join this journey, and remember to like and subscribe. Your presence, your support, is the light that keeps stories like this alive, carrying love into the world where it is most needed.